All right, here in chapter 27, talking about fluids, electrolytes, and acid-base balance, really just an extenuation of the urinary system. So if we look at our body fluids, at least half of our body weight, of course, in water. Total amount of water is separated into two main compartments. We have the intercellular fluid compartment, which is the fluid like the cytoplasm and what's in our organelles that makes up our cells. And then the other part is referred to as our extracellular fluid. This would include blood, urine, those types, spinal fluid, that type of thing. So anything inside the cell, intracellular, outside, extracellular. So each compartment, though, has not only water, but it also has various electrolytes and all other solutes. And that's what sets up that osmolality that we talked about with the urinary system, which is just the number of solutes that are dissolved in the water. So adding water dilutes the concentration. Losing water would concentrate the solution. So again, we talked about this with the urine. If we're increasing water reabsorption, there's less fluid in the urine, so the solutes are more concentrated. If we're not reabsorbing as much water, we have a larger volume of urine, which means it's more diluted. All right, so if we look at these different body fluids, so we have the majority being stored inside of the cell. So intracellular makes up about 70% of the total body fluids. I'm not concerned that you know all these numbers. Again, just kind of putting it into perspective. Again, the majority of our fluid is in the intracellular space. And then the extracellular space making up about 30%, which is comprised of our plasma inside of the blood and that interstitial space, thinking about like in between like the nephron and the blood vessels and just in between all that. All right, so again, intracellular just being everything inside, again, about 40% of that body weight. Extracellular is everything outside, which is about 20%. Again, I'm not concerned that you know these numbers, just understanding that more is inside the cells than outside. But then of the extracellular, we divide that in a few different. So interstitial fluid, that just means in between the cells. Again, for example, between the nephron and the blood supply, like the blood vessels or the arteries. Then within the blood, the plasma would be one of the subcompartments. Lymph, so that lymph system, that's the fluid inside of the lymphatic vessels. Cerebral spinal fluid in the brain, synovial fluid that's in our joints. But again, the majority of it, as we've just seen in the diagram, most of the extracellular is the interstitial fluid in the plasma. So just looking at some of the solutes again, not numbers that we need to know, but just to give you an idea of all the different solutes. So of course we have cations, which are positively charged ions like sodium, potassium, we have calcium. Anions are negatively charged, so like chloride, bicarbonate, phosphates, a lot of proteins. So the main thing that we're showing here though is that for all of these, they're offsetting. So about 162 cations and 162 anions. So those charges offset, and that's the same in our interstitial fluid and the intracellular space. So our positive ions offset our negative. So if we look at these inside, the main intracellular cation is going to be potassium. The main interstitial or outside in between our cells is sodium. We talked about this with the nervous system. Again, sodium is kept high outside, potassium high inside, and that change is what allows action potentials to occur. In the urinary system, we talked about how sodium is used to help transport molecules in. So again, sodium is kept high outside, potassium inside. So again, inside the plasma, same thing. Outside of the cell, sodium is going to be the highest. Now, the main intracellular anion, the negative, are proteins and then phosphates that help make up our DNA and RNA. Interstitial, so again, outside of the cell and in the plasma, chloride ions are what are mainly outside. So outside we have sodium and chloride that are offsetting each other, positive and negative charges. And then on the inside, we have the positive potassium being offset by our proteins and phosphate. So they exchange between compartments. So the two major forces that kind of determine this overall movement in and out is that hydrostatic pressure as well as the osmotic pressure. So again, the movement of water depends on the concentration of solutes. So that osmotic pressure and the hydrostatic pressure, based on changes of diameter, those are the main ones that are allowing for movement. So the total osmotic between the compartments, though, is equal. And that's what we had just looked at, like our positive and negative offset. But again, that total pressure is equal. So this allows for continuous exchange of water and electrolytes. So osmosis is the greatest influence on maintaining those fluids, more so than the hydrostatic pressure. So osmosis, so again, controlling the solute concentration, is ultimately what determines osmosis in the flow of water. So if we look at the effect of osmotic pressure, so again, those fluids are the two main forces, hydrostatic and osmotic pressure. So when the osmotic pressure on each side are equal, there's no net movement. Now that doesn't mean there's no movement. It just means that if some water goes in, some comes out. So they're offsetting. However, if the osmotic pressure is higher in the interstitial fluid, so that means outside of the cell, if that pressure is higher, then the net movement of water by osmosis comes out of the blood. Now, if the osmotic pressure is higher in the blood than it is in the interstitial, then the opposite is true. And that net movement of water would be into the blood. So it's going from a high osmotic pressure to a low osmotic pressure. So if we look at this regulation of that intracellular fluid, so again, it's very different than the extracellular due to that selective permeability. So only some molecules can cross, larger molecules can't leave, even if they're hydrophobic, they're just too big. So we have these transport proteins in the membrane. Some are sodium or require energy, so they're use ATP to go against the gradient. That's active transport, and that, like the sodium potassium pump, helps to keep uneven distribution. So then the fluid, the volume of water entering the blood has to equal the volume exiting each day to maintain that balance. So changes in water volume alter a few different things. So like the concentration of solutes, blood pressure, and the interstitial fluid pressure. So thinking about like swelling and edema. So the primary sources, of course, come from what we eat and drink, but also cellular respiration. So as oxygen picks up electrons at the end of electron transport, hydrogen joins along to make metabolic water. So again, going through respiration and breaking down molecules produces some water. So ultimately, it provides about 1.5 to 3 liters a day. Now the output, of course, our kidneys are the main excretory system, so about 61% moves out in urine, but we also have evaporation. Of course, that can change if we're sweating and exercising, as well as other respiratory kind of ways. So we have insensible perspiration. This is water loss through the skin to regulate heat loss. So again, if we're exercising and releasing heat. And then we also have sensible perspiration. And this is just water lost as heat, typo there, through the sweat glands. So this also would contain solutes like sodium chloride. And then we also have the release of some fluid in our feces, which is about 4%. All right, so if we look at regulating fluid balance, so again, thirst is the main sensation that is going to trigger this. So there are 4 different mechanisms that control it. The first 3, hypothalamic osmoreceptors, arterial, juxtaglomerular apparatus, and dry mouth, are going to stimulate the thirst reflex by activating the hypothalamus, either from changes in osmolarity, so too many solutes outside of the cell makes it hypertonic, we're losing water, we need to dilute those, or changes in blood volume that decrease blood pressure, which activate those baroreceptors or stretch, as well as dryness of mouth. Now, distension of the stomach, when our stomach gets too full, that's actually going to inhibit the thirst reflex. So we'll look at each of these a bit more in the next couple slides. So again, just looking here at the effects of blood pressure, so those osmoreceptors, so neurons on what's called the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, again, just know it's the hypothalamus. Again, there are osmoreceptors. They're detecting increases in concentration of the extracellular fluid. So if there's more fluid on the outside, water is going to come out of our cells. So we need water to dilute out those extracellular solutes. So then we increase that solute concentration and water moves out. So then they shrink and that triggers the action potentials in the thirst sensation. Now the arterial juxtaglomerular apparatus, again, those baroreceptors are sensitive mainly to the stretch on blood vessels. So if we have low blood pressure, this reduces the stretch on the walls. So in response to those arterial baroreceptors send action potentials to the thirst center of the hypothalamus. So again, it's a loss of blood, a loss of fluid that lowers our blood pressure. So this increases the sensation of thirst, so that's going to trigger it. On the kidney, the juxtaglomerular, again, those stimulate those cells to secrete an enzyme, that ACE enzyme that we talked about, with the renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism. So that enzyme release causes renin to activate the formation of angiotensin 2, and then ultimately that stimulates our thirst. The mouth dryness, if we look at it, so reduction in saliva production results in the amount of water, of course, decreasing. So the lack of saliva dries the mouth. That stimulates sensory neurons. They send action potentials and activate that thirst center. And then finally, the stomach distension is more influential in decreasing actually the thirst. So if our stomach is distended, it's very, very full. We want to decrease our water intake so that inhibits the thirst reflex. So too much water consumption can actually be as dangerous as too little. So again, that stomach distension helps protect us from water toxication. Now, if we switch to regulating the output of fluid, so the thirst brings in water, what about getting rid of water? So this is regulated by influencing our urine output, because that's the main mechanism that we lose water by, but also the reduction of thirst. So the mechanisms of those essentially monitor blood pressure, that look at the amount of blood volume. So we talked about some of these with the urinary system. So baroreceptors, though, in the heart, so the carotid sinus and aortic arch have baroreceptors looking at stretch receptors to monitor blood pressure. And if the blood pressure gets too low, that's going to activate our thirst reflex to make us drink. If it's too high, now we need to get rid of water. So like diuretics, that helps get rid of water to increase urine production. The juxtaglomerular apparatus, again, monitors that blood pressure to activate that renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism that can regulate and increase reabsorption. But then also receptors on the atrium monitor changes in pressure through the venous return. So these receptors all activate neural and hormonal mechanisms to regulate how much fluid we're losing. So those fluid imbalances, so dehydration occurs whenever the fluid volume drops below a set point. and that increases osmolarity because now we have more concentrated all those solutes because we've decreased the water. So the first sign is going to trigger thirst using those mechanisms we just talked about. But then we're also going to increase that solute concentration of the extracellular fluid. So now water moves by osmosis out of the cells into the extracellular. And then the opposite can be true. We can have hyperhydration. This is actually water intoxication, so it is possible to consume too much water. So again, that's why that stomach distension is important. So this occurs when we have too much water, and now the extracellular is hypotonic. So whenever that happens, now water is going to go into the cells, causes them to swell, and then they can ultimately rupture or lyse because they can only hold so much water. So this is especially dangerous in infants whenever formula has been diluted and they don't have the right kind of osmolarity of that formula. And then also with fluid replacement therapy can also lead to this because of electrolyte imbalance. So again, individuals who drink lots of like Gatorade and those type of things, we can actually put too many solutes in, creates that kind of osmolarity change that causes too much water coming in. Now looking at the electrolyte balance, so those electrolytes are formed when molecules dissociate. So these are ions in the water. So these would include like organic salts, different acids and bases, and even some proteins can release ions. And then we have non-electrolytes that don't dissociate into ions. So like lipids, urea, glucose, those are solutes, but they're not charged, they're not ions. So electrolytes like sodium, potassium, those are components of the body's fluids, and they are going to have the greatest influence on osmolality. And again, we can have cations, which are positively charged, or anions that are negative. We already looked at those. So the regulation of electrolytes involves a couple different organ systems to maintain that. So if we look at first at the regulation of sodium, first of all, again, main extracellular cation, main kind of one of the main players of osmotic pressure. So it's regulated because again, sodium ions are dominant, so they exert that osmotic pressure. The kidneys are the major route for excretion, so for getting rid of that or changing it. Aldosterone increases reabsorption from the kidneys, so it's going to allow it to go back into the blood. So those sodium levels affect blood pressure because water goes with it. And so if sodium is being excreted in the kidneys, water is coming out, and that's going to decrease the blood volume. If sodium is being reabsorbed from the kidneys, water is going back into the blood and increasing the blood volume. So again, water goes with sodium. So controlling sodium controls the water movement. And then antidiuretic hormone stimulates both water reabsorption on the kidneys and triggers that thirst reflex to bring more water in. So it helps conserve that water. And then the ANH increases the sodium in water excretion, so getting rid of it if there's too much. So again, if there's hypertension, high blood pressure, we need to remove some of that water from the blood. Now, looking here at our sodium, if we have an imbalance, it's called hyponatremia. That means it's low sodium. This leads to things like confusion, seizures. Again, if we don't have enough sodium, those sodium isn't going to trigger those action potentials, so our neurons aren't firing right. Hypernatremia, so too much sodium, like from high salt diets. Now we have too high of sodium levels. This causes like pulmonary edema because again, water is going with the sodium. Also changes to our muscles. They can convulse as well. And again, just some causes and symptoms down here for what can trigger those different circumstances. Now looking at chloride ions, again, predominant anion, negative ion in the extracellular fluid. So we have sodium and chloride offsetting each other as far as charge outside. This has an inhibitory effect on our neurons and skeletal muscles, so it makes it harder for action potentials to occur. So its regulation is tied to the movement of sodium, a little bit to potassium and calcium, but again, just like water, it's mainly due to the movement of sodium. So imbalances, same kind of terms. Hyperkalemia is high chloride levels. Again, this is going to indicate dehydration, meaning we don't have enough fluid, so now it's hypertonic on the outside. This also occurs with Cushing syndrome, which is whenever we have a hormone imbalance. And then hypochloremia, again, low levels. This can indicate heart failure and another hormonal condition called Addison's disease. All right, so now if we look at potassium, potassium is important for that resting membrane potential. If you remember back to our nervous system, it's the one that at rest, potassium is able to move the most through those potassium leak channels. So it's important in maintaining that resting membrane potential of those electrically excitable cells like our heart and our neurons. It's regulated by aldosterone, one of our hormones we talked about. With our urinary system, it increases the amount secreted, so removing it into the urine. It's tied, of course, to the sodium-potassium pump. Potassium is the K here. Imbalances, same kind of terms here. Hyperkalemia, too much in the extracellular. Hypo, we have too low of levels in the extracellular fluid. All right, so if we look at regulating our potassium regulation, so if we're here at the beginning and everything is normal, now if something happens and our homeostasis is disturbed and our high potassium levels become too high, what that's going to do is activate receptors and control centers that are going to act on the adrenal cortex that increases that aldosterone secretion. The effect of aldosterone is going to increase the rate of potassium secretion. So if we have too much, aldosterone is going to cause those nephrons to secrete it into the collecting ducts and then ultimately out through the urine. So having too much potassium, aldosterone gets activated, aldosterone causes secretion, brings it back down. Now, if that potassium decreases, that stimulus is, and that low level of potassium is going to act on the control centers. Again, still the adrenal cortex, but these are going to decrease the aldosterone secretion. So then the lack of aldosterone decreases the secretion into the urine, which ultimately increases our levels in the extracellular space. So now moving into calcium ion. So of course, calcium has a few different things. It's important for exocytosis. So again, in our neurons, the influx of calcium is what triggers neurotransmitters to be released. It's involved in muscle contraction, helps with our action potentials with cardiac muscles. So multiple things. Of course, we think about it with our bones as well. But as far as what it's doing at the cellular level, it's involved in those main things. So it is regulated mainly by the kidneys, digestive tract, and our bones because that's where the majority gets stored. So the balance between deposition and reabsorption from the bone. So if we have excess calcium, we store it in our bones. If we need calcium, it gets released from the bones. And then the balance of absorption from the intestines and then excretion in the kidneys. So how much we're absorbing, which mainly is impacted by vitamin D, and then how much we excrete in the urinary system. All of this will regulate our amount of calcium. So the parathyroid hormones, again, hormonal control, it gets secreted when the blood calcium levels are low. So if we're lacking calcium, parathyroid hormone gets activated. That stimulates osteoclast. That is going to break down the bone. So it is broken down from the bone to release that calcium. It also increases renal reabsorption, so bringing calcium back in from the filtrate. It increases the vitamin D3, which ultimately produces more vitamin D to increase absorption in the intestines. And then also calcitonin gets released from the thyroid gland whenever the blood calcium is actually too high. So parathyroid when it's low, calcitonin when it's high, and that inhibits the osteoclast, so it prevents the breakdown and release of calcium from the bone so that it stays deposited. So then regulating these imbalances, so again, elevated extracellular prevent it from becoming depolarized. Decreased level leads to spontaneous action potentials if we don't have enough of it. Again, our same terms, hypocalcemia is low calcium in the extracellular space. That leads to those kind of spontaneous kind of muscle spasms of our nerves and our muscles because of that low calcium. Then hyper, if we have too much calcium in there, it gets deposited as salts, as calcium carbonate salts in the tissue. That can trigger inflammation that then causes other problems.